Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 5th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, quote, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page from News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles that we referred to, and further comments from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's January 30th. On this day in the year 1649, Charles Stuart, King Charles I of England, was beheaded by Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads at Whitehall as the bourgeoisie took power in its own name and for its own interests. The overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the Commonwealth was the political result of the execution of the English king. Charles repeated on the scaffold a prayer that came from the Elizabethan work The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia by Philip Sidney. When his son, Charles II, was restored to the throne in 1660, Cromwell's 2-year-old dead body was disinterred, beheaded, and the head put on a pike on London Bridge. Today we're horrified by state murders by beheadings. The mentality, as has been said, helps explain why it's so easy to ignore what is most clearly the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern history, if not ever. Obama's global assassination campaign, the drone campaign, which officially is aimed at murdering people who are suspected of maybe someday planning to do us harm. That's from Noam Chomsky. There are a lot of bad puns here about beheadings, headlines, you might say, but we'll try to avoid them, except to say that you're listening to News from Neptune, a headline edition. And David Johnson has the first headline.
Okay, I want to talk today about the recent elections in Greece with the election of majority government of the Syriza party. Now, a lot of people in the United States may wonder, why is this important? Well, why is important is because that it's the first successful fight back in a long time against the policy of corporate domination, in other words, known as neoliberalism and austerity. The new government with Prime Minister Tsipras immediately, they didn't get a national majority. They had to actually bring on a smaller political party with them to get an absolute majority. And there was the NEK, which is a Greek nationalist party, but the Greek nationalist party is not like the Golden Dawn Party, which is a very violent fascist party. The NEK, the reason they brought them on is because they're as much against austerity as the Syriza party is. And they ended up, as part of the deal, the NEK person got the cabinet post of defense minister. But they wasted no time. Immediately, the new prime minister, Tsipras, immediately ended all privatization. He restored the minimum wage. He turned on electricity to people who had had their electricity cut off. He restored the minimum wage and restored health care benefits, which had been privatized. And also did a lot of other things, like saying that they're going to start going after the media and banking monopolies, wanting to break them up and making the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes, which they haven't been doing. So this is really interesting development. Now, Greece, for the last several years, has been in horrible conditions. Greece was never as prosperous as, say, Germany or Norway or Sweden. However, they weren't a third world country by any means. And what happened was, because of debt taken on by Greek oligarchs and the former Greek government from these international bankers, in particular German banks, but also Goldman Sachs was involved, the Greek people were made to pay for these defaulted loans, and which the Greek people had no benefit from. And the austerity measures were horrible. I mean, some people were reduced, a lot of people were reduced to homelessness and eating out of garbage cans. The other thing the new government's doing is immediately setting up food pantries to feed people and starting to do implementation of finding housing for people that don't have it. What's interesting, though, is they still have a debt to pay to the European Union, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, but with their election, they're going to be basically playing some real hardball negotiation here. One of the first tactics they've thrown out there is to say that, well, you're saying we owe all these hundreds of billions of dollars, but what about the Nazi occupation of Greece in World War II? We believe maybe that you owe us somewhere in the lines of 50 to, well, actually, yeah, 50 to anywhere from 50 to $700 billion in reparations. So to me, it's a clever tactic here, you know, to get better negotiations. A lot of people are worried that if negotiations with the European Union banks don't work out, that Greece might have to drop out of the Eurozone, which means they would no longer be part of the European Union, and then hence they no longer have the euro as their currency, and they'd have to go back to the drachma, their own currency, which if they did that in the short term, it would cause some economic problems, but you know, it would be a better alternative than what has been happening in Greece in the last few years. Very interesting. Also on the foreign policy front, the new Prime Minister Tsipras has stated that Greece does not agree at all with the policy of NATO, which they're a member of, as far as putting sanctions on Russia and escalating all the war confrontation in the Ukraine. In fact, Greece has, he wants to keep having very good relations with Russia, which even the previous government had fairly good relations with. So it's interesting that this new coalition government with the Syriza party in the dominant position has already, from the get-go, has basically made it, are actually doing concrete actions to help improve the conditions of the majority of the Greek people, and has started to already take an independent line in terms of their foreign policy. So we'll wait and see what happens here. Interesting enough, there was all sorts of predictions of doom and gloom for financial markets, right before the Greek election if Syriza was elected. But after the election victory, it didn't seem like it affected the financial markets. Maybe a little bit, a few ripples, but nothing like they were predicting. So to me, I found that very interesting. One thing I want to mention, though, is one thing that has been, I saw an article in the Irish Times here today, actually it was yesterday, and it basically is talking about why Ireland should support Greek plan to write down Eurozone public debt. And basically this has to do with a series of zero coupon bonds that would then be invested into various economies to basically build up, sort of demand and social welfare policies to sort of build up what I would call the human infrastructure of a country, so that people can get back to work, make decent wages, and basically, which in turn would help the tax revenue of the respective governments. And at the same time, this would put shift the burden from working people in both Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain onto the wealthy, who were the ones that actually caused this crisis to begin with, and who had benefited from the results before it turned sour. So this is some really interesting developments here just since last Sunday's elections.
Thank you, David. Comments and take on this, David?
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by what's going on in Greece. I think it's the most positive electoral political movement that we can think of, in the recent past. It's too bad that it took so much crisis and so much pain and suffering. But it's positive that the Greek voters turned to this leftist party as opposed to this racist party. This is the specter that we find in Europe now. We find the rise of fascist parties in France and so forth. So this is very positive. The person who, I'm not sure if he's been appointed finance minister or what his title is, but it's a guy named Yanis Varoufakis. And I know Yanis Varoufakis from interviews that Doug Henwood has done with him in the past, which are very worth listening to. And he was also just in the last week or so interviewed on the Real News Network. And he's quite an articulate, quite an impressive and well-informed person, and really fun to listen talk. And he knows his stuff. He knows his neoliberal stuff. He knows his anti-neoliberal stuff. He's a philosopher and a pragmatist. And it's going to be fascinating to see what the tactics are that he will use. I don't think he's pie in the sky. I think he understands what the politics are, but I think he can be trusted to understand what is neoliberalism and what isn't, in ways that could be challenged. He's all about challenging this neoliberal regime that has been suffocating, this German-centric neoliberal regime that has been suffocating Europe for the past years.
Thank you, David. I think this is true. The general comment that struck me was from Richard Seymour, a British writer who has a blog called Lenin's Tomb, which is wonderfully ambiguous, it seems to me. He's not usually very ambiguous. He's pretty good about the politics that he condemns, and he was an early British condemnator of the Bush-Blair war in Iraq, and wrote a very good book about that long ago. He writes this week about Syriza in Greece. He writes, "It's imperative to get this right. Syriza's election is the first real event on the European radical left for decades. I do not mind being overexcited about this fact. I'm well aware of the limits of this success and of the ways in which left governments can be domesticated. Yet I would sooner get ahead of myself with enthusiasm than submit to the wised-up cynicism according to which every gain is an accident and every betrayal was preordained. And this breakthrough does demand some careful research and theoretical work." Close quote. I think that's right, and I both the attitude and the approach. There certainly are questions that are raised right away at the beginning of the Syriza government. I was interested, for example, to read that when the government moved into the presidential residence, the prime ministerial residence, rather, in Athens, they found that the departing government had not only taken all the soap and toilet paper, it's also had removed all the other the things they needed to communicate with, and even the computers, the communication systems, and didn't even leave the password for the Wi-Fi. So,
did they take the light bulbs too?
Apparently, they came close to that. I don't know, but it was not a happy transition on the part of the old government, and the new government made it clear. But the new government immediately went into discussion in Europe about sanctions on Russia, which, of course, the U.S. is pressing. Europe, NATO-stan, as Pepe Escobar calls it these days. NATO-stan, that is the country of NATO, the European Union, is actually, according to Pepe's reading and that of a lot of other people, a dependency of the United States, and particularly of the United States military policy as represented by NATO. But there was a European Union meeting about sanctions on Russia, which of course is part of the vicious Obama administration policy to try to essentially destroy the Russian economy in order to make sure that the American 1% maintains its economic hegemony over Eurasia. But the meeting did indeed finally pass resolutions reinforcing the American-backed sanctions on certain individuals and businesses in Russia. And these sanctions have to be passed unanimously by the 28-member European Union Commission. There was a suggestion that the Syriza government from Greece would not agree to that, in part because the new Greek prime minister had condemned the sanctions on Russia and said that they had no reason to back a neo-fascist government. They were referring to the government in Kiev that the U.S. installed against Russia. But apparently what happened is that Greece did indeed go along with the European Union reimposition of sanction or reaffirmation of sanctions. I don't know what's happening there. I was reading papers this morning trying to figure out what had happened, whether it was just the same disarray that meant that the Syriza government didn't have soap and toilet paper, that it was not prepared, so to speak. Maybe those were the essentials to deal with the European Union. But in any case, the question of the relationship of Syriza to the European Union and to American war plans, which is what they are, for Eastern Europe and Russia, that seems to remain an open question, although Tsipras, the new Greek prime minister, has said that he doesn't intend to support those sanctions. Question: what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think wasn't that the decision from the previous government before they left the government?
Yeah, but they had to.
I mean, the elections just happened on Sunday, and and so I think they came actually physically into office, if you will, sometime on Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yeah, I think that may be right, but I think it doesn't represent. Well, it's not clear exactly how the Greek government is going to deal in regard to Russia, and in some ways, that's the point that at the moment the U.S. is most interested in, that the Obama administration is most interested in. Will this opening in Greece put the kibosh on American attempts to organize Europe? Remember Victoria Nuland's famous comment on what's to be done with Europeans, to organize Europe in support of America's proxy war in Ukraine. This war is serious. The hostilities were opened up again a week ago last Sunday by the Kiev government, and the war in eastern Ukraine, which has been launched under American patronage, has now killed twice as many people as Israel managed to kill in Gaza. It's a serious business, and it's going on, it's continuing, even though we don't get many reports on it in the national news here. So I think the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Greece is very much bound up with its policy vis-a-vis Russia. That is, the Athens-Kiev contradiction is what they're dealing with in Foggy Bottom right now. Foggy Bottom being the location of the American State Department.
It would seem that we might like to remind ourselves at some point in time that when a group of people occupying, or not occupying, but residing, living on a certain piece of land, certain substantial piece of land, might decide that they would like to govern themselves and their economy, that they might like to be entitled. They might like to be entitled to do that. Yes. And I'm not saying it's that easy, but we might like to remind ourselves that there's no God-given role, right that Ukraine has to govern eastern Ukraine if whatever it is, how many millions of people, certainly more than 1 million people in that region decide under difficult circumstances, with all the problems involved in any kind of change like that should be done. And that the what's called the international community might like to facilitate that happening. If the UN were to have any actual role in promoting peace around the world, that it would recognize when people no longer feel that their interests are being represented by the government, which they have found themselves ruled by.
It's a funny line for Americans to take on things like this when we realize that in our political mythology, the two great political events in the history of this state had to do with groups saying we don't tend to be ruled by somebody someplace else. In the first place, they got away with it. That was the American Revolution. In the second place, they didn't get away with it. That was the Confederacy.
Right.
But, so we have, if you like, a conflicted, conflicted history on this.
Yes, ambiguous.
Yes.
to say the least.
You're watching news from Neptune, where we consider the ambiguities. David, what headline did you have?
As long as we're speaking, I mean, I'm really interested in the. Well, let me get to the issue that we were talking about before the show, which seems like a trivial issue, and that is whether Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, is going to be invited to speak before the U.S. Congress in March when he comes to the APAC conference, and all the kerfuffle that's around that that seems to be pointing up. And I mean, Carl. First of all, this isn't personal with anyone, not with Bob Naiman, or I mean, when we don't agree with people, when we don't agree with people that we know, it's often sometimes seen to be as personal, but it's no more personal with Bob Naiman than it is with the people that I don't know. And even before your emails flew around this morning, I was annoyed. I was annoyed reading antiwar.com. I was annoyed reading Mondoweiss, all this attention being devoted not only to this topic, but the idea that somehow, as we've discussed repeatedly on this show, that people somehow see that U.S. interests being undermined by the Israel lobby, U.S. interests being undermined by the military relationship that we have with Israel, as if somehow we're doing bad things because Israel makes us do them. And I don't buy into that dog and pony show. I don't go down that road. I don't understand what the tactics are if the strategy, as it should be, is to get the U.S. government to not support Israel's policies in occupying the West Bank and Gaza, and not to provide them with military aid. If that's the strategy, if that's the policy that we're going after, I don't understand the tactic of challenging, in this case, implying that we're doing that because Netanyahu, because the Israel lobby, because somehow the Israel lobby is using the Congress to surpass or override U.S. foreign policy. It just doesn't impress me or make any sense as a tactic in this pro-Palestine movement or pro-justice for Palestine movement that this is going anywhere. So I'm really uncomfortable when even though I agree with a lot of things that Justin Raimondo writes on antiwar.com, when he spends the column this morning implying that Israel has just been deterring us. I mean, he knows full well what U.S. foreign policy is, but somehow when it comes to this issue, all of a sudden, U.S. is a victim of Israel and the Israel lobby. And I just think the analysis just crumbles in terms of what that actually means.
This is what we've called here before the higher anti-Semitism. The Jews made us do it. I mean, come on. The extreme version of this, and the one that has any intellectual heft at all, is the famous book from 6-7 years ago now. The Israel Lobby.
I think it was 2006, so it's like almost 9
too.
years.
Almost 9.
Yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Not to quibble.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about
what's a year or two here and there.
Between friends. Right?
Yeah, right.
Mearsheimer and Walt's book on the Israel lobby, which had a good deal to say about the relationship of the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. government and the Israeli government, but it seemed to be the highest, the most intelligent statement of the view that David was just attacking, and I agree with his attack. The notion that American interests are being undermined by particularly sneaky or devious Israeli government seems to me to be, to fall to investigation, to yield to a serious consideration, and we should give it that serious consideration. That said, I will say that it's difficult to sort out the politics of what's going on in regard to this kerfuffle, as David called it, of the Bibi Netanyahu speech scheduled for March 3rd in the Congress. You got a take on this, David? I've got a line I want to run on this.
This is complicated in the sense that, I mean, let's face it, I mean, the AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, is a very real entity, and there's been a lot of decent people who have tried to get elected to public office nationally or have tried to run for re-election that have experienced the wrath of AIPAC. They're very extremely powerful lobbying group. You can ask Cynthia McKinney from Atlanta, Georgia, who basically got stung really bad by AIPAC. And I've seen AIPAC even here in Illinois on going after certain candidates, in particular a retired union miner from down in the Taylorville area who was running for U.S. Congress, and the local AIPAC chapter in Springfield viciously attacked him and called him an anti-Semite because he had the audacity to say that on foreign policy that if Israel wouldn't enter into serious negotiations with the Palestinians, that their military aid should be cut off. And so they are very, very real. The question is, a lot of times, is the dog wagging the tail or is the tail wagging the dog? And I think, in general, you guys are right. I believe that, let's face it, the state of Israel, part of the reason why the U.S. and the British were so supportive from day one was because, I believe there's a quote from Winston Churchill that said, we'll have our own little Ulster in the Middle East. So that I have no disagreement with. But, let's face it, I mean, with the inside Israel, there's different factions. And so Israeli policy, depending on who's, the majority in the government, they are out for themselves. And sometimes I think, their policies and opinions differ somewhat from whoever's in the U.S. government. I mean, let's face it, there's been people convicted of spying here in the United States for Israel. There was one case, what was his name, Pollock from the 80s. So, even amongst allies, there's tensions occasionally. So, but it gets tricky. I mean, but in general, I do agree with both of you.
I mean, look, when I read the whether it's Mondoweiss or antiwar.com, when I read this morning that Fox News is also upset about this for whatever reason, that they're offending the wrong people. Well, what does that mean for the Justice in Palestine movement that now Fox News has decided that it just doesn't work, it doesn't look good to have Netanyahu being invited by John Boehner without Obama's approval? What does that mean that Fox News is on board with this? What did it mean that Chuck Hagel, all the energy that was devoted to getting Chuck Hagel a few years ago confirmed to being defense secretary, what did all that amount to? I mean, it doesn't mean anything that Fox News has, and some people on the right, and some of the sort of the mainstream Israel, maybe not AIPAC, but some of the J Street or whatever, the people that are on board with the fact that this doesn't look good. The fact that it doesn't look good and these people don't think it looks good doesn't imply anything about the nature of the Justice for Palestine movement and any progress that might be being made if he isn't allowed to speak before Congress. It just doesn't seem to be worth all this passion, So
tactical thing.
Yeah. I think there are two issues here, obviously connected. One is the influence of the Israel lobby on American government and American foreign policy, particularly. The other is the place of Israel in American foreign policy. Take them separately for a moment. Certainly there is, as David suggests, a vigorous Israel lobby working in this country and often working in the specific cases such as the ones that David mentioned. There are also other major lobbies in this country, at least as powerful as the Israel lobby. The defense lobby, the defense industries at the top of the list, the oil industries at the top of the list, or perhaps second on the list, I don't know. And over them all, them all over the banks. I mean, these are lobbies that are extremely important, and attacks on them will not increase the contributions of downstate legislatures in Illinois.
But the interesting thing is that the Israel lobby, I mean, for a foreign government to have this much influence over another government's internal affairs, I mean, even though I agree with your analysis in general, gentlemen, I still think, this is a phenomena that shouldn't be acceptable.
Well, let's take that up, because I think that's the important part. The notion is here that somehow, via these lobbies or in some other way, the government of Israel exercises occult power over the American government. Hidden, I just mean hidden. Just hidden power over the American government, and turns American policy away from American interests towards Israeli interests. Now, I think that's simply false. The U.S. has used Israel Churchill's statement about an ulster in the Middle East is ambiguous, given what ulster is meant to British politics. But the notion that that Israel has been a sort of landing zone for the U.S. in the Middle East, that's certainly true. Noam Chomsky used the phrase the stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and pointed out that what Israel's primary role is as part of the American control of world energy resources. At the cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East, and indeed in the world, is the insistence since the Second World War by the United States that we control the flow of energy in the world, not just have access to it. Access is not the problem, as we've seen all along, but actually control it. We control it because it's a stranglehold on the economies that really are competitors to the American 1%, the economies of Europe and Asia. But control of energy is the vital pipeline that the U.S. Controls, and the way to do that is by military control of the Middle East. That's where Israel comes in. The effective Israel and American alliance was really established in 1967, or after the 1967 war, because Israel showed the United States that it could handle America's problem in the Middle East. America's problem then was Nasser in Egypt. And Israel said, hey, we did it for you. We make us made men now. The mafia analogy is about right. Israel is a button man for the United States mafia-like control of the world economy, and that's where the real connection. Comes. It seems to me that if we get that backwards, as everyone from Fox News and Justin Raimondo to the left wing of the Democratic Party, if there is such a thing, if we get it backwards, I don't think we understand what happened. Classic case, of course, is 1956, where Israel, in conjunction with France and Britain, went off the reservation from the point of view of the United States, and the United States said, you can't do that. Come back. It's over.
It's kind of like the analogy would be to the political science studies that have been done over the last year, which have shown that 70% of the voters in this country have no influence on government policy. Yeah. What they really said was that 70% of the voters have some influence on public policy as long as the top 1% or 10% agrees with them.
Right.
So there are things that happen that the people want, but the things that happen that the people want are only the things that the 1% wants. And so when Israel does things that maybe leaders of this country might not like, it can go along with that as a kind of quid pro quo or part of the deal. But when things happen that really, if Israel is doing things that really impede the U.S. interests in controlling energy resources in that region, which Israel in no way does, as far as I know, then that would get a very different response. Or the most recent example was, and I think it's pertinent because of Obama's pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia this week, yes, after the death of its leader, really exposing what the nature of these relationships and the bold hypocrisy behind all this relationship. It's become more clear than ever that the United States controls the resources of that region through these primary alliances with Israel and Saudi Arabia, especially given that that there's much else going on in the region which seems to be in flux in relationship to Turkey, Iran, and so forth. So I just don't see, when it comes to those of us who are fighting for justice in Palestine at whatever level, I don't see what the implications of any of this business is for having a movement that pursues tactics that meets those goals. I would say that one movement that would be much more positive than any of all this would be an open Hillel movement. If there were a viable and feisty open Hillel movement among Jewish students on college campuses, which there may be starting to be, that would be something that people should get excited about, not whether or not Netanyahu is going to be speaking to these to a Congress, not one member of which will vote against the $3 billion of military aid that we give to them every year.
That's a very good point. Our friend Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy, who in fact was the guest on the very first News from Neptune on UPTV, as a matter of fact, wrote an article that appeared this morning on Huffington Post and in a couple of other newsletters or email services that we see, and he said the crucial question was, I'm quoting here, whether you stand with the Boehner-Bibi axis, that is the House Majority Leader and the Prime Minister of Israel, who was invited to speak to the House, whether you stand with the Boehner-Bibi axis or stand with President Obama, close quote. And what I'm suggesting is that that's a question of malposé, that in a sense it doesn't matter much, except that it distracts us from what the U.S., the government that we're responsible for after all, is actually doing in the Middle East. How about, I suggested, condemning them all, Boehner, Bibi, and Obama, and demanding a reversal of the Obama administration war policy in Europe and in Asia. The greatest risk of a wider war, even nuclear war, comes not from Iran's non-existent nukes. This is the argument about what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis Iran, is supposedly the occasion for Boehner's asking Netanyahu to speak to Congress. The greatest risk of a wider war, even nuclear war, comes not from Iran's non-existent nukes or even from Israel's hysterical provocations on the matter, but from Obama's vicious proxy war in Ukraine. Like all U.S. administrations since the fall of the USSR, but even more belligerently, the Obama administration is working to damage Russia in order to control the Eurasian economy. This was so pronounced in the Clinton administration, of course, that the Clinton administration actually drove down the life expectancy of Russia in the 1990s substantially, with a depression more severe than the 1930s depression in the United States. And this was American policy. This is what we were working to do. Like all, the American client regime in Kiev, the government, our puppet government in Ukraine, has already killed more people in Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, than the American client regime in Israel recently killed in Gaza, and the attacks continue today. The Obama versus Boehner good cop versus bad cop charade in D.C. is at best a sideshow that continues to mask the U.S. government's imperial policy from the only one of its many enemies it really fears, the American people. The administration is in fact engaged in a politics right now attempting to wean Iran from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is sort of the Asian NATO. It's the conjunction of Russia, China, and Central Asian states in an alliance, now so far only economic, not yet military, but possibly the latter, an alliance to counter what Pepe Escobar calls NATO-STAN, that is the European military and economic alliance under American control. The Obama administration is attempting to wean Iran away from the SCO, from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and restore the status quo ante pre-1979 relations when U.S. control of Mideast energy resources rested on a tripod of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. Obama, who says he's surprised to find that killing people is his strong suit, is willing to kill a lot of people to this end. His drone attacks, which have killed as many people as his war in Ukraine, amount to the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, says Noam Chomsky. The Bush, Obama, and probably coming up, Clinton, regime is working for the American 1% and their economic advantage in Europe and Asia, as the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon regime once did in regard to Southeast Asia. The American people must stop them once again. I think these things in the old maxim, the old SDS maxim, everything is connected, and that we can't talk about one of these issues without talking about the others and talking about the real center of them all, which is American policy. You want to respond, David?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Even when you take in consideration who controls the United States, and basically the 1%, the ruling elite, and you know what their objectives are, what they're in the past, and what their current goals are. This current policy it still seems insane in a lot of ways. I know it's not insane; it's calculated, but it doesn't make sense. Well, I mean, all they've done with this recent thing, well, these recent events like pushing with the policy in Ukraine, all they've done is further tighten an alliance between Russia and China. And also, you know, with Iran, and you see other things like this around the world to where their policy. I mean, I don't want to. There's a lot of people out there that try to say that, you know, like the previous Bush administration were stupid and incompetent, and that's not where I'm going with this at all. I'm just saying, if you look at the big picture, what their goals are, to me, it doesn't make sense of why they would want to push Russia to the point to where they would form an alliance with China. That to me I would think would be a very frightening notion for our current rulers in this country for the future.
Now remember, I mean, if you put this in the context of the long-term American policy, and I insist the notion that American policy changes much at all over time is simply false. There's a remarkable continuity in American policy running back literally a century. The question of China and the opening of China, as it was discussed in America at the end of the 19th century, is the background from everything through the Pacific War, the Second World War in the Pacific, up to and including American policy today. The notion in by American policymakers is control. Control of the world economy. This classic statement being George Kennan's Policy Planning Document 23 from 1949, where he said, look, we have 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth. It's going to be difficult to hold on to that because the rest of the world won't like it. Therefore, we're simply going to have to deal in, I'm quoting him now, straight power concepts in order to hold on to the disparity, to maintain the disparity over what the U.S. controls and what its population is. Well, now that's a very look. Remember, Kennan was not only one of the longest-serving members of the post-World War II American Diplomatic Corps, or the planner. He was also a liberal. This was the liberal view. This was the progressive view. This wasn't some crazy John Birch Society notion, nor was it some sort of pie-in-the-sky notion of universal benevolence and can't we all just get along? This is what American planners were doing for a reason that had directly to do with the control of their wealth.
It still makes no sense to me, Carl. I would think they'd try to play Russia off against China until they are able to, neutralize one or the other, and then, I mean, to actually create conditions to where it combines the two in the sense of having a closer relationship, both economically and politically. I mean, I would think that would be a nightmare for them. I mean, look at the combined population and military strength, not to mention certain degree of economic strength the two have together as an alliance. I mean, to me, it makes no sense tactically. I mean, I understand the motives of the ruling class in this country, but that particular tactic makes no sense to me.
Remember Lord Palmerston in the middle of the 19th century said that Britain had no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And it seems to me that if you really want to sketch American policy for the last century, particularly since the Second World War. That's the fundamental rule. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. That applies, by the way, to Israel, back to our earlier discussion. But I mean, Nixon going to China, is a classic step in this. The question of how the U.S. will play off, as you suggest, its competitors in the world is a very real one, and the U.S. government has shown itself to have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, and to keep doing that. Now, it is true, I take your point, though, that the present surprisingly belligerent stance towards Russia is having the effect of driving Russia and China together, as they have done on energy and as you say, military matters. This is serious, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility to think that it's going to be looked back on and seen as a colossal error by the United States. I agree with you on that.
When Kennan made his famous statements in the early 1950s, the American working class, which was benefiting from the fact that the United States was left with 50% of the world's wealth. Well, that seemed to work pretty well in terms of getting the working class to go along with the Cold War. But in the last 40 years or so, the 1% has actually decimated the working class. What's that strategy? What's that tactic? Who would believe, given that the American leadership needs the American people to go along with all of this foreign policy, what's the point of decimating the working class to the point where they might actually realize that this isn't being done to their benefit? But they go ahead and do it anyway. And so what we're left with is this culture in which, and as we enter into Super Bowl weekend, this culture will be in its full glory. This culture of militarism, patriotism, sports, and American Sniper, and everything else that makes it so difficult for people to understand the dangerous game that the American leadership is playing with the whole world and with the people in this country. And the question is whether the people in this country whether we can wake up to what's going on. And I don't know that. We may be too far gone. When I think about American Sniper, when I think about some of the things I'm hearing about, what's being said, what the people's reactions in movie theaters when this psychopath kills children, I just don't know what to think. But we got to keep trying.
David, I can answer the question, at least on the domestic front. I think it's basically arrogance. I mean, the ruling class in this country has gotten to the point, gradually, but at this point in time, they have gotten to the point to where, their attitude to the American people is, so what? What are you going to do about it? I mean, they don't come out and say that, but that's their view. Why do you think that they are militarizing the police all over this country and having nonstop propaganda 24/7? I mean, they're hoping that the propaganda will carry them through, and those people who are become aware and don't like it, and look at, not to mention all the increase in surveillance on your average citizen. All the stuff that's happened post 9/11 and basically is increasing exponentially. I think they've just become so arrogant that they're prepared. They've learned lessons from history too, and I think one of them is that they're not going to back down like they did in the 60s and the 1930s.
That's an interesting point. The other possibility is that we're dealing with an American ascendancy, an American 1%, that's like the French ascendancy in 1789. But when right before the French Revolution broke out, the ruling class in France couldn't imagine that anything like that could happen. The notion was that their control was so clear, so absolute, so justified by history and custom and the general relationships in the society that they weren't in any sense at risk. Well, they found out something different, and it's resulted in a great deal of trouble for all classes in France. But I think that if you're talking about arrogance, why, we might notice that ruling classes about to experience a reversal, whether it's in France or Russia or perhaps even the United States, have always thought themselves quite quite comfortable, quite protected, not threatened. And that's very interesting. And in America today, we're dealing with a neoliberal establishment, an establishment which, as you described it, David, is struck back at the 60s, struck back at the last attempt at social reform in this country, and won.
And striking back against everything that was, produced for the better in the 1930s.
Very true, because
to them, those were the two low points, the 30s and the 60s, because there was open rebellion. The 30s, economic rebellion, and the 60s, cultural and political rebellion.
Well, and
economic
economic and social too. Yes.
True.
But I think the one thing that, Mark Twain's line, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme." You know, and if we look at this particular rhyme, what's new? The new syllables in the line in the last 40 years has been the conscious attempt by the American business class, for lack of a better term, to put the lid back on. It has been a reactionary policy that's worked. Wages in this country, as you know, David, essentially are flat from the early 70s on.
Or stagnating, or declining, actually, in real terms.
There we are.
Yes.
And that was a change from the post-war period. And that wasn't just a result of bad weather. It was that's another issue, I know, but still. What I mean is that it wasn't an accident. It was a conscious policy by the American ascendancy. They won, they're winning, and the question is whether the victory can be reversed, and they're, as you say, getting ready for it. So.
And whether things have to get as bad as they did in Greece. But the positive thing about that, again, is that it's a very intelligent group of people that has taken power in Greece right now and showed a real alternative to fascism, to the fascist alternative to what neoliberalism has wrought on these countries. So,
and it is an example of what can be done, and that's important. The fact these explosions on the periphery of neoliberal control, Iceland, Argentina, and now Greece, are a cloud no bigger than a man's hand on the horizon to the world capitalist class. But it may presage something.
Not to mention Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia,
exactly,
Nicaragua. They have been losing control in the periphery, as you say, and but they seem to be totally focused on the Middle East and Central Asia with Russia.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a few minutes left. David,
do we have a few minutes left? How many? Okay.
I know you had another perhaps related point that you wanted to mention.
Well, I just wanted to throw out the general topic. Maybe we'll revisit it at a time. As some of the people who've watched this know, I've been trying to sort of do some philosophizing about our economic system and try to understand it at a somewhat deeper level. And I think that one key to that is understanding the role of pensions in relationship, especially to the working class and people who are expected to invest in those pensions, the relationship to Wall Street, the relationship to the financialization of society, and the relationship of all that to this neoliberal regime that we always refer to. And as pensions, as we have this governor coming into power, and we have this pension problem in this state, and then we have always the specter of them wanting to take Social Security away from us or privatize it in some way. I think that I wanted to put that on the table as a very important general and fundamental issue in thinking about how our economy works and how we actually save for the future, what saving really means, what investment really means, and once again, the most fundamental question of all is what money is and how money is being used. And I would suggest in the most general sense that the rise of the pension as central to the American economy, to Wall Street, is one of the most fundamental things that we have to ultimately question and really get rid of in terms of the way, people say, you want to get rid of my pension? No, I want to have a public pension system which transfers wealth that's being currently created to the people who need it, as opposed to this scam or this sort of Wall Street scam of pension savings, which has gotten us into this horrible bind.
I want to definitely be invited back to that program when we discuss that topic, gentlemen. I have some quick announcements real quick. Tomorrow, Rich Whitney, the gubernatorial candidate from the Green Party in 2006, who obtained nearly 12% of the votes in Illinois at that time, will be on the World Labor Hour at 90.1 FM and at WFT.org from 11 a.m. to 12 noon. And he'll also be at the Champaign Public Library in person speaking on Saturday as well from 2 to 3. And stay tuned for a future Urbana Public Television Labor World's View interview with Rich Whitney, which will be done actually tomorrow, but will be rebroadcast sometime in the future, as long as video footage of his speech at the Champaign Public Library. Also, I want to recommend here to watchers, if you don't know about these media sources, television media sources, I highly recommend them, which is, besides Urbana Public Television, is Free Speech Television, which has Democracy Now! And a lot of other good programs on them. RT, which is Russia Today. Take with a little grain of salt anything they say about Russia, but it's great. It's a different perspective that people need to have compared to our corporate media. And I don't care what Victoria Nuland says about RT, anyway. And that should give you, this should give you a hint that maybe you should tune in and watch it occasionally, especially Abby Martin's program, Breaking the Set, which is on from 5 to 5:30 Central Time. And last but not least, the Real News Network. Very excellent. In fact, I'd say the Real News Network is probably my favorite of all these as far as its programming and analysis.
Also, we should mention there are two competing events, unfortunately competing, tomorrow afternoon, Saturday afternoon, on the 31st of January. From 2 to 3 p.m., there will be a meeting at the Champaign Public Library that will be devoted to reconstituting a local version of the Illinois Green Party. The Green Party continues to exist. Rich Whitney, who was gubernatorial nominee of the Green Party that David's talking about, will be a speaker at the Champaign Public Library at 2 tomorrow, along with some other folks that are in this room. And the Greens had a local chapter, the so-called Prairie Greens, that existed for a while. I, in fact, was the Prairie Greens candidate for Congress in 2002. I even have some of the old posters. I think I'll bring them to the meeting tomorrow. Now, at
Carl,
the same time.
Yeah, Carl, you got, I believe in the city of Urbana, you got 37% of the vote, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. That was then. This is now. And now the task is to put the Green Party back together. And that's, as I say, Champaign Public Library tomorrow at 2. If you're interested in the Green Party, if you're interested in something outside the neoliberal, neoconservative conjunction of the quote, major parties, close quote, come by and see what the Greens can do for you, what you can do for the Greens. Remember that in these last midterm elections, the major parties gathered fewer votes than have been cast, a fewer percentage of the votes that have been cast in a national election since 1942. A good number of our friends and neighbors are not enchanted with the possibilities that are being offered by either the Republicans or the Democrats. So come look at the Greens. Also, at the same time, there's a meeting at the Independent Media Center. We want to say something about that, David?
It's an anti-police militarization meeting. Unfortunately, it's going on at the same time as the Rich Whitney speech at the Champaign Public Library. It starts at 2 o'clock. So both are very good. A lot of people I know said that they would like to have come to the Green, but they decided to pick the anti-police militarization meeting. So take your pick, I guess. It's kind of bad when you have conflicts like this, but on the other hand, there's definitely things happening in this town, so that's definitely a good thing.
And the problems are there. The groups involved in both meetings will obviously have a word to say to one another afterwards, and the story is not over. So come and participate if you want. Concluding remarks, gentlemen? You have been watching News from Neptune for the 5th week of the new year, 2015, a headline edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere on NCU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.